Donning his Yes hoodie, the Prime Minister joined AFL legend Michael Long on the final stretch of his 650-kilometre journey from Melbourne to Canberra.
Back in 2004, having walked nearly 200 k's from Melbourne, we asked Prime Minister Howard to look at Indigenous life expectancy and employment outcomes. When we finally met with him in Canberra, we asked, where was the love for our people?
Still a little bit.
In the 19 years since that meeting, the gap between non-Indigenous and Indigenous Australians has not closed. In some areas, it's widened. A yes vote in the referendum on the voice to Parliament will give Indigenous people the self-determination that we asked for all those years ago.
I walked into the Parliament not that long ago, and Michael was in the foyer. He come over, we had a cuddle and a kiss, and we had a conversation because we're mates. I don't think people should be getting cocky. We've still got, 4 or 5 weeks to go.
On October 14, we are being asked as Australians to walk just a few short steps, to establish an advisory committee. That's what the Voice is, an advisory committee whose only power is the power of its ideas. If they're good ideas, they'll be accepted. If they're not good ideas, they won't be.
Senator Jacinta Price is set to outline her objections against the Voice to Parliament in her speech to the National Press Club.
I am one of 11 Indigenous voices currently in Parliament, and I will not accept the lie. The rationalisation of many Indigenous voices of the Yes campaign who suggest our democratically elected voices are redundant because we belong to political parties. It is a suggestion that is offensive not only to me, but my coalition colleague, Senator Kerrynne Liddle.
I think we have to be careful when we talk about the No campaign. I am no to this form of constitutional recognition or it being in the Constitution. That doesn't necessarily make us all the No campaign, all the same.
Fear is a powerful emotion, but it's not one that advances a country. What advances a country is bringing people together and a positive message.
Liberal Senator Kerrynne Liddle is the Shadow Minister for Child Protection and the Prevention of Family Violence. The Indigenous Senator is advocating a no vote in this referendum. I spoke to her earlier. Senator, thanks for joining us. I'd like to start with something your Country Liberal Party colleague Jacinta Price said today at the National Press Club, which really seems to go to why Indigenous Australians face disadvantage. She said there's no ongoing negative impacts of colonisation. Do you agree?
Well, I think there are a whole range of reasons why Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, some people, find themselves disadvantaged, and it goes to the core of this issue of the suggestion, the stereotype that we are all the same, or that we've all had the same experiences growing up and that we're all at the same place in our lives. What I find difficult about those conversations about colonisation is that takes us back to 1788, and it completely ignores the incredible contribution of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in this country to the growth and development of this country, not just in the mining industry, but in the hospitality industry, in the pastoral industry. My family were involved in the pastoral industry. They owned pastoral properties. They worked in the tourism industry. They built their own businesses. They went to war, and taking everything back to colonisation just does us a disservice when you ignore the gains that have been made in our communities, the fact that people are employed across a range of sectors and some are doing very well. The gap between those who are doing very well and the gap between those who aren't is where the problem is.
You talk about your own family. You've spoken about this previously. Your own mother was a member of the Stolen Generations, and you yourself have said those things have a huge effect. There is an intergenerational effect.
Yeah, there is. There is an intergenerational effect in that when my mother, she's passed away now, but when she used to talk about this, she'd say, I have to think about things differently. I have to do things differently. When I'm working through challenges, I have to recognise that I have to approach them differently.
What's the
but
intergenerational
that's like every
effect?
Single human being goes through those issues.
Sure, but just coming back to the point Jacinta Price was making today, there is no negative impacts of colonisation. You seem to argue there is.
Well, look, one of the things about this whole discussion around voice is around people focusing on the minutiae issues rather than the big issues.
This is no small issue, though, with respect, is it? Whether there's intergenerational...
It is to people right now who want to move forward, who want us to focus on the things that matter to the most, who want us to focus on those functional and dysfunctional organisations. They don't want to talk about colonisation. When I go and visit people, my own family even, in remote and regional areas and in the cities, right? They don't talk about the impacts of colonisation. That's what the academics talk about, right? They talk about my house has no electricity and they don't care if my power goes off when I live in a remote community. They talk about my fuel costs a terrible amount and I can't even get to medical attention.
But it's important to identify why the gap exists between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians across so many areas. Why do you think
Well, I go back to, again, you're going back to a historical...
No, I'm asking why the gap today exists between Indigenous and non-Indigenous
I'll tell you why it
Australians.
exists. It exists because we have to start focusing on those service delivery organisations that are not assisting in the way they are supposed to, those people that need it most. The most frustrating thing in last week's sitting of Parliament was watching this Parliament, the government, who talks about improving the lives of Indigenous Australians, knock back a simple Senate inquiry. You know how many inquiries we have each year? We asked for a simple Senate inquiry into those organisations that actually exist to improve the lives of Indigenous peoples, to find out what's working, what's not, from their perspective. But they didn't want to hear those voices.
Let's talk about that then. If the problem is current bodies and organisations failing when it comes to service delivery, do you think we need any sort of change here, need any sort of Indigenous voices to improve that delivery?
Well, let's tackle the Indigenous voices. I don't accept that Aboriginal people have not been involved in conversations to date. You know, we've got 13, I think it is, members of Parliament here in the Australian Parliament. There's a number of parliamentarians in the state and territory parliaments. We walked past the press club today, and the irony of going to listen to Senator Nampijinpa Price, walking past the photographs of 8 Aboriginal people who identify as Aboriginal people, and 4 of those are on the referendum working group,
Indeed.
and 1 is a member of Parliament.
So do we need Indigenous voice bodies at all?
Well, I think we need to improve the way we engage on these issues.
And how do we do that?
Well, you need to talk to people. You know, when I go to communities, I don't fly in with a charter flight. I take a car in, I take a swag in case somebody wants to have a longer conversation. I can stay with them, stay overnight, have a conversation. I actually go into their homes because I'm invited into their homes.
Well,
That's what it's going to take.
All of that's fair enough, but do we need Indigenous voice bodies or not?
Well, I think we can do better talking to those people who are affected by those decisions.
Okay,
you know, the
through
Election
Indigenous
report
voice body, I'm just trying to get to whether you think we need, because the Liberal Party position, which is very clear, is that you want to put in law Indigenous voice bodies. Why?
Focused on local and regional voices.
Why do we need
Because the funding from the Commonwealth goes to the states and territories. The funding from the Commonwealth through NIAA, that's only one agency that gives out funding. There's 1,000 external providers that get money from NIAA every year, right? It's those organisations we need to have a greater focus on. It's what the states and territories are doing with the money that goes from the Commonwealth.
So voice bodies would help fix that?
Well, voice bodies must be in that conversation, but the people who actually hold those people to account are us as parliamentarians, are the policy makers, are the service providers, and you know, it's everybody in that service delivery supply chain.
But just coming back to this point, you haven't worked out how exactly these voice bodies you do support might work?
Well, we've got the Kerrynne report. That was done under coalition government. That explored a range of different models to look at that would
That's
look
the sort
at
of model
voice.
you'd support?
Right. Well, there's a lot of suggestions and recommendations in that nearly 300-page report. And even the Prime Minister has not come out and said, those things within the Kerrynne report are what I would support.
What about
in a
you,
voice
Senator?
model.
Would you support them?
I support anything that engages better with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, but not this Canberra-based voice.
Okay, but you support the principle of voice bodies in law?
In law, yes.
Even though you don't know the detail, you support the principle?
Well, I support the principle of engaging with people on things that matter to them, but I don't support the principle of putting that in the Constitution.
So
if the Prime Minister wanted to do this, he could do it right now. He could have done it a while ago. He could have actually done it without taking this nation to a divisive referendum. He could have done all those things. He
So
could
when
have
it comes to
started improving
changing
those lives last week.
When it comes
if
to
he
changing
voted
the
with us.
Constitution, then, what sort of constitutional change would you support?
I'd support recognition. It is symbolic, that is true, in the Constitution. But in the Constitution, in the words, well, let's talk about what we've got in front of us now, because that's what is actually going to the people.
But with respect, the opposition's holding out this alternative, this symbolic recognition, as you've just indicated. What are you talking about?
Well, let me tell you with what the problem I've got with what we've got in front of us now. I think what is important to them is not only do we properly reflect in our our foundation document the essence of who Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are, and we deal with the business that is the same business as everybody else, because this is where it all started, this inequity, right? Health, housing, education, employment. And what I say is, you know what? You start building in high expectations, not just of those service organisations that are supposed to support you, high expectations of our parliamentarians, high expectations of individuals. Then you start getting improvement. And you know, Jacinda and I have been in the Parliament for just over 18 months, and most of the Indigenous MPs that are in Parliament have come in the last wave.
So coming back to the question, what's the alternative? What sort of constitutional change would you support?
Well, I'd support constitutional change, which is the one that I believe has the majority of support from Australians, which is recognising them.
How would you find that?
Well, I explained before, that's about identifying spiritual association, cultural association, our contribution, our history. You can capture that in some words, but you take those, you come up with the words, you take those to the people. You don't do a referendum in the way this one has been done.
That could take years, though, couldn't it? Would it happen within the next decade?
Well, I think what's been really clear from this process is that Australians want recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Constitution. It's an historical fact. It's just an admission. It shouldn't take us too long to fix it. Given we've been told throughout this entire process, since I've been quite actively involved in it, that's what people want. But they also want to improve the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Just a final question then. If, as you're advocating, Australians vote no on the 14th of October, what happens the next day? Would there be celebration for some? Do you accept some would feel wounded? How do we come together?
Well, as an individual, I'm already sad. I'm sad that we're going to a referendum in the way that we actually are. I won't be celebrating. I'll again be sad, because if you believe the polls in every state and territory, we're not heading to a result that the Yes campaign would like. We have done this through a process of division. This is very divisive. But that said, Reconciliation Australia has said reconciliation won't die, as Noel Pearson has said. That's not going to happen the day after. That is a process that belongs to all Australians equally, as I believe the Constitution belongs to all Australians equally.
Senator, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.